First off on the agenda, we're going to move right to the council update, and we have Councilor Afghan with us this evening. Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, commissioners. I have 5 items that I want to share with you, and it should be a short update. First, and very important topic, we proclaimed that this month for Wheels on Meals Month, where this program helps many of our residences. This last week, we talked about the LORAC 1.5% for art project, discussed some of the options that the Art Council has for putting some art pieces in the LORAC. Proceeding to vacate the public interest in portion of the property near the Bryant Road, next to the Union Pacific Railroad. And we also discuss the vertical housing development zone pilot program at the North Anchor site. We had a great discussion as to doing at least one of these pilots to understand all the ins and outs of the program and see how beneficial it can be for our city. Some of the conversation we had was how does it also impact our grading and bond capability and so on and so forth, to make sure that we look at this incentive program for the developers from a holistic point of view. And of course, we had a North Anchor project update also. In that update, the developer continue to assure us that they're still very committed to the project, and they are still spending a substantial amount of money to push the project forward. And there appears to be some challenges with financing the project due to the market that most of us may be aware of. That's my short update. Are there any questions or comments for me?
Thank you, Councilor Afghan. Commissioners, are there any questions? I'm seeing none. Thank you very much for the update.
Thank you. I'll stay on and listen for a while if you don't mind.
Okay. All right, moving on in the agenda to public comment for issues that are not on tonight's agenda. Christina, do we have any public comment this evening? Okay. Seeing there is none, we'll move on to Commission for Citizen Involvement General Updates. I personally don't have anything. I'm not seeing any commissioners with updates either, so we'll move on to the minutes. We'll start with the minutes from August 20th, 2023, our meeting on that date. Is there any discussion or any corrections needed on those? And is there a motion? Yeah, I have a motion.
I move to approve the minutes as written.
Second.
Sorry, I forgot the date.
August 28th.
August 28th.
Okay, we have a motion approved in a second. All those in favor say aye.
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 Oppose? Motion carries 5-0. Now for the minutes for September 11th, 2023, may I have either discussion or a motion?
I move to approve the minutes from September 11th as written.
A second.
Motion and second for approving the minutes from September 11th. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? right, motion carries 5-0. Thank you for that. And I think we're ready now for our work session on climate-friendly and equitable communities. Public comment will be accepted at this work session. Tonight we'll hear our second work session on the state of Oregon's climate-friendly and equitable communities rules for parking reform, which will include a presentation from Evan Manvel, Climate Mitigation Planner with the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Erik, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Stewart. Just want to thank Evan for being able to come here tonight. He was able to come in earlier this month to help us present to City Council, so really want to thank him for his time. It's really much appreciated and has been very valuable for us here. I also wanted to point out that we have an additional representative from DLCD here tonight. She just wanted to come as she is our regional representative to introduce herself. Her name is Kelly Reed, but I'll let them both introduce themselves now.
Thanks, Erik. Hi, everybody. I'm Kelly Reed. I'm your regional representative from DLCD. DLCD kind of breaks the state up into 9 different regions and assigns I think all of us are former planners, former local government planners, to be the main point of contact for jurisdictions within that region. So my region is all of Clackamas County and the cities within, and then Multnomah County and the cities within. And so I work with staff mostly, but I get to see all of your plan amendments and zone changes that come through. And more importantly, I get to work on any big major projects or grant-funded projects that that DLCD through grant programs that DLCD offers. So I have only been with the department for about a year, so I haven't had the pleasure of actually attending a meeting in Lake Oswego yet. So I wanted to take the opportunity to come and meet you all, introduce myself, and let you know that I'm a resource for you from the State Land Use Planning Agency and for your staff as well. So thanks.
I would just point out that Kelly is also a member of the Housing Production Strategy Task Force that we have assembled from DLCD.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kelly. You all are lucky to have Kelly. She's one of our best regional, well, they're all great, but anyway. My name's Evan Manvel. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a climate mitigation planner at the agency, and I have been thoroughly involved in the climate-friendly and equitable communities program development of rules and now implementation. So I'm here to talk about the parking reform, which is kind of one of the first steps, particularly for the metro region in that program. So you all have heard about the parking reforms that came down from this program. And before I get into the details of them and why we proposed them and the commission adopted them, I do want to be really, really clear and that governments not mandating parking doesn't mean that parking won't be developed. And there's a long history of that the market realizes there's demand for parking, and it does some nuanced touches. And there are examples from all over Oregon and all over the country where developers have built a lot more parking than is mandated when mandates are reduced. So here are 4 examples of Eugene building huge parking garages when they didn't have to build any, and parking garages are the most expensive parking to provide, of course. Los Angeles using some kind of flexible building parking offsite. In Corvallis for student housing, building more than 2.7 spaces per unit. So they were like, this is on the edge and people are here are gonna build a bunch. And then sort of a standard suburban development in Cornelius where they're required to build 1, and there are at least 6 in that photo, like 2 in the garage. If you don't count those, there are at least 4. So the market realizes a lot of people own cars and want off-street parking. So with that said, we still think it's worthwhile to reform parking. Parking mandates have been around for a while, but they do have a lot of costs. and it's always kind of a choice between parking and something else. So this is an example of kind of the spatial need for parking spaces versus an average 2-bedroom apartment. You can see it uses a lot of land to provide that parking to house the cars. Here's an example. Olympia, Washington did a study of its commercial sites and said, wow, you know, people who own businesses are using more than half of their land for off-street parking and about a quarter of it for building. You know, that's what their models show their customers want, but it's a big expense for businesses on average. Some Oregon State University students did a GIS study, and they said, wow, like, let's use our tools. About 11% of all land in the city limits of Corvallis was for parking. And that's similar to other cities that have done this analysis. Somewhere between 10 and 20% of all land is used to store vehicles. They're big, they take a lot of space, and it displaces other things. Here's an example of a couple of downtowns in Oregon. All the stuff in red is parking. Corvallis and Klamath Falls. This is pretty typical. This is kind of the most valuable land in a city usually. And it pushes uses apart. It makes it less walkable, and it consumes very high valuable land. So what we often say is, hey, you probably have enough parking if you manage it well. So all that said, how much does it actually cost? So it uses a lot of land, but how much does it actually cost to build parking? Here are some numbers from the last few years. In Eugene, they did a study 5 years ago, and it said, well, a parking garage costs about $42,000 a space. In Corvallis, Oregon State did a study. They were looking at options. They're like, well, if we're including the land and the debt, it's $62,000 a space for every parking space in a garage. If we do it surface, it's a lot cheaper, but it's still expensive. When you're looking at a private residential single-family home, something like that, it's thousands of dollars. And of course, if you're building a structure around it to protect it from the elements, it's a lot of money. Overall, the academics that have looked at this have said, well, on average, how much does it cost of your rent? And it's about a sixth, a tenth to a fifth, you know, of the cost of all housing is to store your car or your cars. So it kind of comes down to a trade-off at times. Are we prioritizing housing cars or housing people? When Oakland instituted its parking mandates, it found that, not surprisingly, the cost went up a lot to store cars off street, and a lot fewer houses penciled. It just couldn't build as many houses because it didn't make economic sense. A few years ago, some students in Eugene said, hey, we've got a duplex, we've got an area that's zoned for duplexes, and they require an off-street space for each unit. We can actually draw a fourplex on that lot. We can only fit 3 cars off-street, but if we do that, and we let somebody park on street or somebody not own a car, it's Eugene, we could get 2 more housing units. So we could double the housing units if we just didn't require so much parking and we upzoned. So that's kind of why a lot of folks from a lot of different perspectives are realizing that parking has real costs, and we've kind of over-regulated parking mandates. Here's the US Chamber of Commerce saying, hey, this is a real problem for our economy, along with the director of the White House National Economic Council. So the most vulnerable among us are often paying for this. Affordable housing, again, providing a lot of parking displaces housing units. So this is a study up in King County, Seattle's county, where providing a space per unit just meant there were fewer houses built. Now, the nice thing about all this, if there's a nice thing, is that we actually realize a lot of our efforts to regulate a bunch of parking everywhere has created too much parking. And so there's some efficiency to be gained. So you look at various studies from out of state, the King County again, or the Bay Area in California, or in Albany, or in Hillsborough, and you're finding kind of on average, we're expecting people to own more cars or consume more parking than they actually do. So there's kind of 25 to 40% of parking that's actually empty. People go in the middle of the night and they count empty spaces. For residentials, that's usually what you do. You go between midnight and 5 a.m. and you're like, okay, pretty much everyone who's going to park here is parking here, or this is the maximum consumed parking. So this is kind of what all the evidence shows on parking, is that it uses a lot of land, it's expensive, displaces other things, and there's some waste in the system. So there's kind of, in some ways, that's a good thing, that we can have some good things, and it saves us money, and actually people can still park. Now, one of the other things about parking is that it's usually bundled. So, we all kind of know what bundling is. It's hidden in the costs of other things. You don't pay for it separately. But what that means is everyone pays for it. When they go to the grocery store, whether they've driven there or not, they pay for the grocery parking lot. When you rent an apartment and the parking space is not separate, you pay for that parking space whether you're using it or not. So non-drivers are subsidizing drivers. And that's a real incentive to drive, more than you would if you were actually paying your own costs. Now, the California Air Resources Board said, hey, if we get parking right, both in terms of how much we provide and internalizing the costs, we could cut up to 15% of all our climate pollution from that project if we get parking right. It depends area to area, but we kind of see this across the academic literature of when you are providing a lot of something for free, people will consume more of it than they would if you provided less and it had a cost. And that's basic economics, but the data show that it's true. A car ownership and consumption, how much people drive, is not a static thing. A lot of it is built into our landforms, and a lot of it is built into our society. But on the edge, there is some change that happens if you don't provide as much parking or if you internalize it. So there are kind of 4 studies here that say, okay, people will own fewer cars if they have not free parking, and they'll drive less if they have not free parking. Particularly impactful, and this isn't what our reforms mainly do, is when people actually have to pay money every time they drive. And that's pretty intuitive. I think we've all experienced that. That, oh, parking's gonna be really expensive at the basketball game, maybe I will take transit. Or maybe I will carpool, or maybe I will do something else. And that's kind of what we've seen when people have to pay when they drive to work. They have to pay instead of just being, oh, I'll park in the free parking lot. It really changes how people get to work. Or the opposite of that is where you say, oh, it's free, but if you don't drive, I'll give you $5 a day. So to not consume that parking space as an employer, people drive a lot less. So that's called parking cash out. So you're getting cash or a free parking space. And there is a significant number of people who would prefer cash. So the last couple of points before I get into what our actual reforms do. Parking is an equity issue. Car ownership and consumption correlates pretty well with wealth and privilege. People, most of the carless households are in the bottom quintile of income. They're the poorest among us. And homeowners own 50% more cars than renters, and et cetera, et cetera. This isn't a surprise. Cars are really expensive, so it correlates with income, how much you own and how much you drive. But pretty much the poor are subsidizing the rich when it comes to parking, is the point. Here in Lake Oswego, most renter households own 1 or 0 cars. You can see from the chart that most homeowners own 2 or 3 or more cars. So it's the pattern across America. It's not too much is unique there. You have fewer people on average who own 0 vehicles, but you do have a few hundred households who own 0 vehicles. So, so what happens if we actually get government out of the way? If we say, hey, government, get your foot off the gas pedal when it comes to encouraging driving, and you just let the market figure it out. Well, the market is diverse. Like our housing market, the parking market is actually diverse. And what we've seen in various cities that have reformed parking, Buffalo, New York, student housing, and we're like, oh, students are poorer, they don't need as much parking, and they would actually prefer housing with less parking. So that's what they saw. Mixed use development, again, people can be more their needs with walking and not driving, so they provided less spaces. Most single use multifamily was about the same. The market was like, well, this is what our market shows. We think even without the mandates, we're going to provide a bunch of parking. So that's kind of the nuance of the market that is more nuanced development to development than a city code, than a zoning code or a development code. Similarly with Minneapolis, that's what happened. Places with near transit had less parking and had lower rents. So some of that cost savings is actually passed along to folks. In Los Angeles, back in the late 90s, they said, hey, our downtown is struggling. What can we do? Let's do a few reforms, including some fire code stuff and some parking stuff. They saw a huge boost in housing units. So decade to decade, it was slow, and then they did adopt a reuse ordinance. Parking was still provided with a lot of that, but a lot of it was off-site, as I mentioned earlier. So people are getting some units. They were just, developers had a lot of flexibility in like realizing where the cars would be stored. So you can kind of see, there's too much data on that slide, but there were still parking spaces generally provided. Just about a third to a half of it was not on the site proper. Now, Seattle rolled back its parking mandates, didn't completely eliminate them, but they rolled them back. And an academic came in and said, well, what happened over these 6 years? 18,000 fewer units, or 18,000 fewer parking spaces were built at $30,000 a unit, which is cheaper than it is now, but at that cost, that means we've saved $537 million. Some of that may be more profit for developers. A lot of it's in reduced rent. A lot of it's in just housing that got built that wouldn't pencil otherwise. So this just goes on. San Diego did the same thing, big boost in affordable housing units when it reformed its mandates. Fargo, North Dakota did some stuff in its downtown, and it just really boosted its downtown. It was a real, students and faculty and mixed-use development came in downtown. Here in Oregon, since January 1st, when a lot of our parking reforms went into effect, we're already hearing these stories trickle in from around Oregon. We've seen people taking advantage of our parking reforms. So here are 4 pictures. One, it's a place in Central Point that was a non-conforming use, and they were going to have to fix the parking to reuse it. And now they no longer have to get that parking up to code. They have a lot more flexibility in redeveloping that. This is a development in Eugene that just the way it fit on the site, it couldn't fit an alley and off-street parking, but the on-street parking could make it. And so there are four housing units they're going in, a place in Beaverton that was going to be 9 units and didn't quite pencil. Now it's going to be 13 units and is going forward. And the last one's an arcade in Tigard. The guy was like, well, there's this big parking lot behind me, but it's not on my site. And so to be able to serve beer, I'm going to have to expand my parking lot a lot. And that's a big headache and a real expense. And they were like, well, you no longer need to provide that parking. And so he was able to expand his business significantly. And we're hearing these stories, a hair salon in Grants Pass, a puppy fertilization clinic in Gladstone. Businesses are taking advantage of this. Developers are taking advantage of this. We're seeing more affordable housing. We're seeing more market rate housing. It just provides a lot of flexibility in the market. Okay. Thank you for sitting through all that as to the why we did all this. Now let's talk a little bit about what it is. Our reforms apply just in the Oregon's 8 metro areas, including Portland Metro. They were adopted by our commission in July last year. A lot of them, as I mentioned, took effect this January 1st. And you asked for a little more time to work through this and talk through this, so you're asked to do your complete reforms by next December. So this is generally what they do. We kind of scoured the parking codes across Oregon, and we said, hey, what are the best ideas? Let's take a handful of those and have every city do those. You choose a parking reform approach, and you do some more parking management if you're over 100,000, but you're not over 100,000. I went backwards. I was doing so well. Okay. Now, what that all kind of skimmed over is the parking reform part A, is what we call it. And one of those things we did is near frequent transit, you can't mandate parking. So this is the part of Lake Oswego that's near frequent transit, within a half mile of that. And that's kind of based on the data that transit is the #1 predictor of parking consumption. There's a big federal study with lots of regression analysis and things, and they said, oh, actually it's, density matters and other things matter, but transit is the #1 predictor. So developments along that corridor no longer have to provide parking. The other piece that went into effect that we thought was best practice was kind of no parking for equity uses. So affordable housing, subsidized housing, really small units, SROs, single room occupancy, childcare that we're really short of, shelters, and facilities and residences for people with disabilities. So a lot of those places are going to provide parking, but governments can't mandate it. And we also capped multifamily mandates at 1 per unit. So you can mandate up to one space outside of that transit corridor. So a couple of things that are in what we think are best practices. Garages can't be required. Garages are the most expensive parking mandate. I love garages. I love ping pong rooms. A lot of people don't use their garages to store a car. It just doesn't make sense for governments to be mandating that. Some more flexibility on how you can meet your parking mandates. If you're I have my neighbor will lease their parking space to me, that meets my parking requirement. Large parking lots over a half acre have to do some mitigation for that really big area of concrete. And then existing parking lots can be converted for transit or bicycle uses if developers think that's important and want to do that. Now, the big local decision for you all is which of these 3 paths to take when it comes to choosing your flavor of parking reform. They're all significant changes. I don't want to say we're being really deferential and just letting you do whatever you want, because we don't think that's best practice, and that's not what the legislature and the governor kind of directed us to do as far as moving forward on climate and housing choices. But here are the 3 options, and we call them options 1, 2, and 3 generally. Option 1 is to just repeal parking mandates citywide. To say, hey, the market can actually do a pretty good job of figuring out how much off-street parking their consumers are going to want. And that's, as I said, has been done for decades in various cities and in Oregon, in various places for a while. But if you don't want to do that, which is kind of the easiest thing for city staff, but it's fine. We think there are another couple of good solutions. One is something called fair policies, and this is in line with what I mentioned before, that pricing really matters in terms of changing behavior. So implementing 2 of 5 policies. Option 3, and then doing some other things. Option 3 is just scaling back your parking mandates pretty dramatically, but still allowing some for large commercial and industrial and single-family homes and things like that. With both options 2 and 3, there are kind of ways that parking is counted. And in your centers in Lake Grove and downtown, there are requirements there. But yeah, so those are kind of the three options. And that's what you all get to decide, you and your council. So with the fair policies approach, I'll just touch on this briefly. I'm almost done. Thanks for your patience. The first two, we say you have to choose 2 of these 5. And it used to be 3 of these 5, but we heard some pushback that that was asking too much, and we actually think this is a good path, so we wanted to make it easier. The first 2 ask you to pass an ordinance saying you have to charge for parking separate from the units. And the first is for residential, the second is for commercial. Various cities in California and Washington have done this, and it really is good for equity. Those people who want 2 parking spaces buy 2 parking spaces. Those who want 0 don't have to pay for parking spaces they're not used, et cetera. The third option is flexible commute benefits. I talked about that, of where employers are paying people instead of if they don't use a parking space at work. The fourth is a tax on parking lot revenue. I don't know, I don't remember seeing any commercial parking lots in Lake Oswego. So that can be, some cities are kind of seeing that as a freebie. Let's tax something we don't have anything of. That wasn't the intent, but it's allowed. And the fifth thing is reducing your multifamily mandates even more than that 1 space per unit to no more than a half space per unit. So those are, choose 2 of those 5. You have to choose one of the first 3. You can't just choose the last 2. But as long as you choose one of the first 3, you can choose whatever you want as your 5th, as your second. Okay. As I mentioned, option 3 is kind of reduced mandates on a lot of things, smaller scale developments, small businesses, dormitories, bars, schools, et cetera. What remains after you do all that, as I kind of said, is larger scale commercial and industrial and some single family homes generally. Yeah, so these are sorts of developments that for various reasons we don't think parking mandates mesh well with them. Got a request from a health department to say no bar, nothing that serves alcohol should have a parking mandate. We didn't go that far, but we did put bars on the list. So the last thing you have to do under option 3 is you have to play around a little bit with paid parking. And that can just be a residential parking permit of like $15 a year in, First Edition or wherever your parking is most in demand. It doesn't have to be meters. It doesn't have to be super complex, but it's just kind of learning that muscle of, hey, let's internalize some of the costs of parking. Or if you don't want to do that, you can unbundle parking for residential. So those are your options. Given all that, and that I kind of got down in the weeds in options 2 and 3, a lot of people are like, whew, that's a lot. Let's just do option 1. And that's fine. Sherwood is working on option 2. It's possible Medford is exploring option 2 as well, trying to do some of those fair policies because they want to maintain some of their parking mandates. But most of the cities have thus far that have acted have chosen option 1 and just said the easiest thing to do is let's free up some planner time. They don't need to review all the details of what the parking provided, if it's adequate or not. Yeah, and they're choosing that. Last thing, this is my last slide, is we realize that one of the things that happens sometimes when you deregulate parking is you have to manage parking a little bit. And so one day during lunch, I walked, in the 6 blocks around my house in Salem, and I realized, and I just took pictures of the signs. So the private market and the public market have figured out all sorts of nuances depending on their needs. Here's one, like, you get 90 minutes on this level on the north side at these meters. Yeah, so there are a lot of details about times and things, and this is just kind of standardly done. So the market is robust on this. People have figured out how to do this. You have figured out how to do this in Lake Oswego, that you have a two-hour time limit on this side of City Hall and no time limit on that side of City Hall. Like, you all can do this. But it is something you might have to do a little bit more of as developments come in, and there might be some more spillover parking. So I do want to acknowledge that. Spillover parking is kind of when there's more demand than there is supply on a specific site. So, yeah. So with that, thank you for listening to me rant for a while. My friends listened to me rant about parking a lot longer than that, but yes, open to questions and discussion.
Well, thank you for your very, very thorough presentation. It was very, very interesting. Do we want to, I guess if we have questions for Evan, we should probably do that now, just in terms of just clarification questions from his presentation. Go ahead.
Thanks so much, Evan. Really appreciate that. What do the proponents argue for keeping mandates in place? Like what are their arguments?
Thank you for the question. I think that those people who want mandates want to avoid the management side, and they want to avoid conflicts. Like when I talk to city councilors, they say people complain about parking more than anything else, and you're going to increase that. So, you know, it's, and to that, I say, well, we need to do more parking management. And the department received $3 million for this biennium to help cities with various program implementation things, including parking management. So I think that parking mandates have been a conflict avoidance tool. If we hide the cost of parking and everything else, then it gets easier for us. It does, you know, and you don't see those costs because housing that doesn't get built, you can't see, or, you know, businesses that just pile it in and add it to every little last thing or take some out of your paycheck, like you just can't see it. So it's kind of a conflict avoidance thing. Yeah, and there's certainly a lot of the other stuff is about local control, that they would prefer that the state is not pushing folks to do this. They're like, we're local, we know best. And that's, you know, I understand that dynamic, and the state, both the legislature and various agencies have required a lot of cities and taken away some of your, and that's a challenge. I realize we're the caboose in that train in some ways, or we're not the caboose because there are more train cars coming if you hear the legislature talking. So so those are a couple of the things that I've heard when people are really frustrated. Yeah, and then people are like, oh, people just own cars, and you have to provide for it. So there's this skepticism about the market and trusting developers to provide it. My experience is lenders are pretty risk averse, and they build parking, or they build development like the development that's right next door, which has some parking because it was mandated or because it was just in the model. So yeah, this is a step to it. The lenders are the next challenge as far as convincing people that there is some waste in the system and we can gain from that. So those are a few of the things I've heard. Yeah.
Who generates the mandates?
So parking mandates in local codes, they have a long history of, and generally what happened is somebody said, oh, there's not enough parking on street, so let's require some off street. And then cities copied each other and said, oh, your city's doing that, you have less conflict, that's great, let's do that. And then the Institute of Traffic Engineers came up with a big book, and then they're like, this is science. And like, look at this chart. And you clearly need 3.2 parking spaces per bowling alley lane. And so people rely on kind of this, what most people, well, what a lot of reformers call is pseudoscience, because it's like cookie cutter from suburban developments. I'm like, okay, there are 3 examples. Let's apply that to every city in America, as opposed to a developer being like, how much are my consumers going to want? So yeah, so a lot of it is copying cities to cities or relying on a manual that has very limited data. So that's where the numbers in the mandates come from. But the mandates were, as I said, is kind of came forward as a way to hide the costs and avoid conflict historically.
Do these mandates include the spatial size of the parking?
Yeah, so there are some spatial elements to parking space design. It's not something I focus on a lot. ODOT does some of that, building codes does some of that. Some other state agencies are more interested in the spatial sizes of parking spaces. Obviously, ADA parking has its own set of things and needs, for example. But yeah, it's usually it's the state agencies having some of that, and then local governments do something within the norms of the state regulations. So local governments are say, oh, we want a larger than average drive aisle or parking space size, because I hate, bonking onto my neighbor, or, cities adopt these into their codes, the standards, often based on, with that kind of,
So if you remove these parking mandates,
yep.
so what's the result when you do that, when there's a development, for example, shopping center? What is then going to happen to the people who design these things? Are you going to expect them just to come up with some sort of formula for themselves that is workable for their experience, or who is going to be doing this?
Yeah, usually the developers and the lenders work out amongst themselves what they think is adequate. I think that you maybe have experienced that Trader Joe's has those smaller than average parking space or parking lots. Walmart has larger than average. Walmart has recently scaled theirs back by about 15 to 20% because they realized they were overbuilding them. So at least the national chains have their business models, and they kind of adjust them over time. And then the local competitors often just look at what someone else is doing, and they look at it. So there's a way to kind of study existing development and do parking utilization studies and parking turnover studies to kind of say, hey, how many cars are parking here for how long? How many spaces do I actually need? So you can do a deep study if you want, or you can cookie cutter off your neighbor, or you can have a multi-billion, German conglomerate of Trader Joe's or Walmart or whatever else that has figured this out generally. And sometimes they screwed up. Sometimes they're like, oh, we didn't build quite enough parking. We're going to buy the next door lot and add a little bit. Or we built too much and we're going to sell some of it.
So in your view, in your study here, would you say that it's better to put the decision-making as far as parking lots in the hands of the individuals who are developing the parking? Or is it better to put it in the hands of the city that might, for example, restrict parking because of a policy and so forth?
So a couple of things. One thing that wasn't in my presentation is there's some limited parking maximum requirements, including for cities over 25,000 in metro. So there are some kind of requirements that cities have some caps, so you don't really build a super lot of parking. You already meet most of those. We added in some residential ones on top of what metro required in the late 90s that you're conforming with. So there is some desire to nudge the market in that direction and not build a lot of wasteful stuff that increases stormwater costs and encourages more people to drive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Can I add something?
Yes.
I think what Lake Oswego would do, and what every city is going to do, even if they repeal their parking mandates, they would still retain in their code standards for what a parking lot should look like and how it should be built if a developer does still choose to build parking. So all of the landscaping standards and the stormwater standards and the space dimensional standards of how large the parking spaces are and the drive aisles are, you would still keep that in your code because you would still be regulating that part of the development, but you just wouldn't be saying exactly how many spaces have to be built in that parking lot. I'm not
Is
sure.
there negotiation that goes on with the city right now between the builders and what the city wants so far as a parking lot goes, Erik?
No negotiation. I would say there's no negotiation on the requirements. There are oftentimes, discussions with the community about, what their sort of desires are and what they're willing to provide. And oftentimes that is above the required minimum parking that we've talked about, at least in the example that I can think of. So yeah, we don't negotiate the requirements. We look at the actual uses that are proposed and use our calculations that we have in the code right now. Of course, a lot of those have already been changed under CFEC Phase A, at least in this part of the city, such that much of those have already been repealed in this part of the city. But for the most part, that is how we implement parking requirements where they are required.
I'm sorry, we haven't repealed them. They have been superseded by state law. If the state law went away, they would be there. Okay, so we haven't repealed anything.
Right. Fundamentally, we've repealed them. That's shorthand. So basically, yes. Fundamentally, they are superseded by the state, but they are no longer in existence legally.
But you have a preference when you hear something like this. You have a preference whether or not there should be mandated parking spaces or not. Does the city have that?
We have our current code, which we implement, right? So again, some things supersede the code, but for the most part, we look to the code and it says, it turns out a certain number for the amount of use or the amount of units that they're providing in that development, and we say you comply or you don't comply. So no, the city is not actively negotiating for more parking necessarily, unless there are developers that are trying to sort of do that as a sort of olive branch to the community, I suppose, in certain instances. But those negotiations are never about what the city requires or would consider compliant and approvable.
As I just said, we have a cap on the amount of parking they can provide. 125% of the minimum parking under the metro requirements, commercial property gets capped at that. Okay, so and that's mandated on us by metro. Okay, so mandates come from a lot of different places, state, metro, et cetera. But we also make a decision as to what we want to require, and that's what was done legislatively, I think in 1961, is when you found the first parking requirements. I guess I would also add under a current standard, if the applicant thinks that the parking requirements is too much for his business, generated by his business, they have the other option of providing a traffic or a parking study, which would show that their particular parking need is less than the expected one under the table. So you can go numerical or you can go a parking study.
So I guess in that way, we could be encouraging them to utilize the parking study in a way that would be somewhat different than the parking table. So yeah, that is somewhat of a negotiation that we do have with developers.
And the result of that, sorry, I've been in this for 20 years. The result of that is the parking study makes an average assumption as to what parking would be necessary for particular use. Not all uses are average. Those that are less than average would benefit from a parking study. Those that are more than average do the numerical, and you end up with not enough parking by that use. And I think probably my best example on that would be Weiser's at Lake Grove Shopping Center. He was saying, we need a sign because there's more people that need to come in here. So he had oodles of parking. Then when Zupans went in, everybody went there and there wasn't enough parking.
Yeah.
We didn't change the use. It stayed as a grocery store. Okay? So that's an average, and but we can't require under current code. We don't require more parking based upon the particular specific use. Okay? So they get to use the numerical capped at 125%.
Thank you.
Councilor Afghan, do you have a question?
I think there was a question about who's pushing back on this topic and requirement, and I wanted to share something that I said in the city council meeting. First, I want to be crystal clear that I am for a lack of a better term, exchanging garages and parkings for residential and affordable housing. So I want more people to have a roof over their head than most of us having parking garages. So the thing that gets emotional is the justification how we ended up there. And I I think there was some comments in the city council that some of the topics said in this presentation are a stretch to make a point. For me, it doesn't matter how we got there because the mission is to get more residential units and have, again, roof over people's head than having parking spaces. So that makes sense. How we get there, we have some options, and I think we have to talk about those. The other thing is, let's talk about Lake Grove area. All of a sudden, we put a bunch of commercial buildings there, and the developer decides how many parkings they would have or they won't have. The majority of the Lake Grove area doesn't have curbs and sidewalks. So how is that parking off street or in the neighborhoods over spills impacts the neighborhood? And I was one of the counselor who said, I'm not for the easy solution, number one, and open season for parking, but I'm for the right solution. How does it impact the first edition, where again, they don't have curbs and sidewalks? How does it impact the neighborhood that they do have sidewalks or so on? And the other comment was, if we have a number of units in a small lots with units that are less than 750 square feet, so it becomes another Sellwood where there's absolutely no parking for anything, including commercial application. But all of these topics are under that emotional conversation. But at the end of the day, we got to do to get a roof over people's head. So that's what I wanted to share, that it's some of the reasoning are stretched to get us there, but we need to be there. So which options do we want to take on? I think those are the conversations that we'll have to have. Thanks for the opportunity to let me share my thoughts.
Thank you. I have a question. Isn't there already a mandate in place where we cannot park units less than 750 square feet?
Yeah, that is correct, Chair Stewart. So that's part of Phase A of the CFEC parking requirements that we implemented as of January 1st of this year. Currently, throughout the entire city, not just in one area, but citywide, no parking is mandated, no parking is required for residential units that are less than 750 square feet in size.
So maybe I'm thinking about this wrong, but is it conceivable that you could ultimately end up with more parking under option 1 than option 2? And the reason for that is option 2 seems to take some of the maximums and reduce them, as an approach, going from, like, say, 1 parking space per residential unit to maybe 0.5, whereas option 1, we're not requiring parking, but we're not really reducing the maximum potential either, right? We're purely leaving it to the ebbs and flows of the market. So is it conceivable that you could actually end up with more parking under option 1?
I'm not sure if that is the case. I think just as a part of any of these options, the city will be required to implement parking maximums. We already have them, as City Attorney Boone pointed out. They may already be compliant. So my understanding is that really when we're talking about with option 2, the minimum requirement would be no higher than a half space per unit of multifamily housing. So
Oh, that's a minimum, not
Yeah.
a maximum. Okay, so
Yes.
that's
it's a
where
maximum minimum, if you will. Yeah.
All right, that's
yeah.
my misunderstanding. Then.
It gets confusing because we're talking about the state giving us guidance as to the rules that we can apply. So it's like state rules for the city and then city rules for everybody for parking. So
Okay,
it gets a
so
little bit confused.
one final comment then, and Councilor Afghan, I think, explained it pretty well there at the end there, and I was thinking about this during the presentation, is Lake Grove. And I know it's a town center, but it's kind of not really, it doesn't have a lot of the attributes that a town center has, right? It doesn't have the gridded sort of layout. It doesn't have on-street parking. You know, its main road is more of a through road and not, you know, one that's designed to sort of move parking in and out of blocks. So, you know, as I'm personally, and I don't want to get too far into sort of preferences right now, but as I'm personally sort of leaning towards option one, I'm not quite sure how to think about Lake Grove in that context, because I'm a little nervous about that.
Yeah, I have some maps that help kind of point this out, but I will say that regardless of any of the options, Lake Grove is not going to have required parking. So it doesn't matter what we select. Lake Grove is a town center, and there will not be required parking there under any of the options. So one thing I would point out, though, Lake Grove, you know, there are a lot of you know, when it comes to, well, and I guess I should say there could be some required parking in Lake Grove, but it'll be drastically reduced under almost any all but one scenario. There could be like a half space per unit in Lake Grove, but anyway, under this option. But I will say though that you know, in terms of the strategy in and of itself, you know, we do expect that the market would respond to the locational constraints. We have seen that, for instance, with zoo bands, they originally provided less parking than they eventually wanted. So they revised their parking sort of layout and configuration and came back to us with more parking after they originally sort of went in with their original configuration. So, you know, we do see this. We do see developers responding to those conditions. And there might be certain areas, as you point out, of the city that could just in and of themselves, because of those locational aspects, lend themselves to, you know, just the market will require more parking there. Also, you know, I think a lot of city councilors were wanting to reiterate that this is not an isolated approach, that this approach would need to be supplemented with infrastructure investments and pathways and things like that, transit investments, pedestrian infrastructure, active transportation investments. So I think a lot of folks saw this as one sort of approach that we could take, but it wouldn't be sort of an approach in isolation. We'd probably have to look at, you know, as Evan was pointing out, some parking management, you know, looking at what is happening as a result of this and sort of making some changes as we go, which we do have the flexibility to do that. But yeah, you know, I think in Lake Grove, it's certainly a point well taken that it's not the traditional sort of grid system, but it is an area where the city has been for a long time planning for growth and has zoned for that and is looking to realize some of the density that we plan for that area. And, you know, I think there are a lot of things that were taken into consideration with the zoning there, and we would like to see that realized. So, you know, I think there certainly might be a potential for there to be some parking spillover, and the city has tools to address those issues if those do arise, as well as, you know, developers having tools in their bag as well for their market, depending on the market. But it won't, you know, come right away. I think there will be somewhat of a, you know, we'll have to see how it goes and respond and sort of make sure we get this right in the right places. So I guess the short answer is we would have to, you know, look at this holistically with a variety of other investments, and potentially, in particular, that parking management piece will be important to sort of monitor as we go forward.
Okay, so last question for me. Has any city you know of taken on this unbundled parking thing yet? And how has that gone? Where the city's actually mandating the cost of parking?
Thank you for the question, Chair Stewart. No city in Oregon has done that yet. I've wished. There are, I believe, 5 California cities and 2 Washington cities, Seattle and downtown Bellevue require it. In California, I think it's Oakland, Santa Cruz, San Francisco, Berkeley, and one other, sorry, B+. Anyway, and it varies. I think that some of those cities are just requiring it, and there are signs up at multifamily units, and it's a complaint-based system, and they haven't necessarily gotten a lot of complaints, so I don't know if the dynamics of the renters are actually getting charged, and they are desperate to keep their units so they don't complain. There's so they're implementing that, but talking to the city planners, they're not exactly sure how effective it is at really rewarding people. Certainly, in my private experience and in anecdotal experience, when you talk to people who rent in Portland or I rented in Seattle, I was like, oh, I'm not going to get a second car because I actually, just the market figured it out. They're like, we're going to charge you extra because for parking. So the market kind of gets there eventually, depending on the size of city. And that is an actual real incentive for people to consume less parking and to own fewer cars. But the cities that have implemented haven't done a lot of let's do an academic analysis or let's figure out how much that's changing behavior or that sort of thing.
Oh, so have none of those cities actually set a cost on parking or?
So, thank you. So, they've done different things. A lot of them just say you have to unbundle it. So there's some malicious compliance where people are like, it's an extra $1. There are other cities that say it has to be market rate. And so that's what we put in the rules is it has to be market rate. So I don't, it's been a couple of years since I dug into these details. But yeah, it's usually, in Seattle for me, it was a couple $100 a month. And similarly, my colleagues who live in Portland, that's, $150, $200 a month. And they're like, oh, I decided not to own a car because of that. Or I'm going to fight for on-street parking because on-street parking is somewhat poorly managed in the city of Portland, but anyway. So yeah, people do things like that. That's, sorry, I'm not fresh on those details. That's my recollections.
Could I just ask one more question? Could you restate the goal in your study here? What's the main goal that you're trying to achieve?
So this program was launched under Governor Brown, and she said the state needs to course correct. We're totally missing our climate pollution reduction goals. So figure out how to reduce pollution from transportation. And she directed DEQ and Department of Energy and ODOT and us to work on that. So we were like, how can we change how much pollution comes from transportation? And our piece of that pie is generally getting people to be able to drive less and shorter distances when they do drive, like through land use tools. So reducing climate pollution. In that order, she also said focus on equity. So that's why it's called the Climate-Friendly Equitable Communities. I think since we launched the program, the housing crisis is crystallized, and we've got a new governor who issued her own executive orders on housing. And I think that the housing crisis is a driving motivator for this. So parking has a lot of co-benefits. Parking reform has a lot of co-benefits. But I would say those three are probably the top in motivating this: climate, equity, and housing. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for such a detailed presentation, and obviously you've been in this for a while because you're very versed in all the knowledge of this. You talked about business, you talked about developers, you talked about cost, and now we have the goal, which is to basically get people out of cars. But I haven't heard anything about the quality of life that the residents are going to now have a change in. And have you done any research on what they think?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner. We haven't had the resources to do public opinion polling or focus groups or things like that. The program was designed with our largest rulemaking advisory committee in our department's history. We had 40 people, and we demographically balanced that. So people of color, poorer people, people with disabilities were on that committee. So we had perspectives that are commonly excluded from planning decisions for various reasons. So using that 40-person committee, we relied a lot on them. We got a lot of testimony, hundreds of pieces of testimony, both in favor and opposed to various parts of the program, including parking reform. Yeah, and generally it fell along the lines of homeowners and people with more resources wanting more of the status quo, and other folks wanting some reform. So, you know, that's a really tiny slice of 4.3 million Oregonians, or even the 2-point-some million people who live in the metro areas this applies to. So I don't want to say that's indicative of the broader public belief, but those were the trends we saw in the inputs that we saw. Yeah.
Since our last topic on this was about 6 weeks ago or something like that, I started to do my own sort of just man on the street sort of conversations, and ended up talking to over 70 people. And the question was, for example, I went to the farmer's market that's here, and I said, you know, what would it take for you to get out of your car? And I was surprised at the responses. Almost all of them said no. And the references were, well, I just live in First Edition, not too far away. I have to carry all these things back, or I'm going from here to my kid's soccer game, you know, point to point to point. I talked to people at Safeway that park right over here. What would it take? The same thing, you know, in the summer on a very nice warm day, yeah, I might wheel my little basket, but in the fall and in the winter, no. So I appreciate all the work that's gone into this, but I'm just concerned about this city. I don't really care what happened in California. I don't really care what happened in Seattle. I want to understand what people here really want to have. And as I did more and more of this, I just found that the quality of life here really is one that you really want to try and protect. And as we go through all of these issues, and I appreciate all the challenges we had that come from the state level, is what's the right thing here in the minds of the people that live here? And how do we get a focus on that? Because my research was one of, wow, okay, it's going to be a real battle. And you had said that, you know, one of the things that people most complain about is parking aspects. I was in, up in Seattle, which is called the Central District. Are you familiar with that? And, you know, that one was an interesting one in that they were able to take a house out, you know, good sized lot, put in 3-story little buildings, no garages. And what happened is everybody parked on the street. Now, you cannot get an SUV down the center of the street, barely, because you've got cars on either side, and side view mirrors get, you know, smashed off. And I had a chance to talk to, he was a neighborhood watch person, and he just was appalled at what had happened with the best of intentions, but you can't fix it now. There's no way to go back. So people are not buying or renting those homes that have cars because I have to park 2-3 blocks away and worry that my car is going to be sideswiped overnight. So these decisions we're talking about have real consequences that oftentimes cannot be changed. So how do we get a good feeling for what the people here really want, whether it's option 1, 2, or 3, or something in between? I'd love to work with you and talk to people here about what do they think, so we can make a much more informed decision on what's right for Lake Oswego.
Thank you, Commissioner, for those comments. I would generally assert that the people who choose to people who want that will get that. They'll choose a house with off-street parking, or an apartment with off-street parking, or like some people want a 4-bedroom house, some people want a studio. Like, okay, great, find it. And it may not, that may not be, there are a few hundred households in Lake Oswego that own no cars. I don't know who those people are, but there are some people who want that. And that's the joy of taking the government kind of cookie cutter approach of like every single last development has to do this, and letting people choose for themselves in the market. So there are certainly sometimes where there are some conflicts in the public space, and parking management is important, getting those sizes right, as was alluded to, making sure that the right-of-way is clear and all that. Those are challenges for Erik and you all to work through. But generally, yeah, some people you talk to in the farmer's market, their household probably owns 4 cars, and they're going to find housing that can house those cars. And the people with 1 car would like a different choice. So this is kind of letting people choose, and a lot of people want the Lake Oswego feel and move here, and others choose a different sort of community to live in. So that's how I see it. We're not here saying you can't build parking. Like, none of this is saying you can't build parking. That's kind of why I tried to start my presentation there, because that's often where our minds go, and that's not the case. So
yeah, I think I would also just reiterate, we're not necessarily forcing people to not use their cars. We're not forcing people. We're not, trying to go out and get your average farmer's market person to say, yes, I think it'll be a great idea if I just walk instead. We're talking about policy and the built environment around us, and we found that a lot of studies show that the way that that's constructed has a huge impact on the way people make their decisions about how they get around the city. So that's kind of the logic here. We're not saying, listen, everybody in Lake Oswego, you're not going to have parking anymore. Quite the opposite. It's just saying the market is going to provide parking in the areas where that would be needed. And again, important to think about, we have these citywide policies that are going to be in effect. Some of them already are in effect citywide, that will have a large sort of impact on this stuff. So we're kind of looking at it in that context as well, of where does it make sense to implement these policies, considering the sort of larger landscape of policies that kind of has differing impacts on differing uses throughout the city is a little bit complex and difficult to comprehend in a lot of ways. So, I think it's important to point out that we're trying to do smart planning, we're trying to do good planning. A lot of that has to do with utilizing land much more efficiently. A lot of it has to do with providing housing needs for folks, and we have long established that there is a deficit of housing here in the city, or at least with the housing needs analysis that was adopted recently. We know that we have our work cut out for us in terms of strategies that we need to be looking at that would promote the development of housing. So I think, there might be some concerns that we hear amongst the community, of course, but I think when we think about the needs of the city of Lake Oswego and quality of life, we have to think about housing people and putting a roof over their heads, as Councilor Afghan was pointing out. Making sure they can afford to live here would have a giant impact on folks' quality of life. So I guess that's kind of just my response.
The other thing that I would add is our redevelopment agency did a parking study in the downtown area, oh gosh, I don't know how many years ago. It's probably in the last 10 years. And because there was this perception that there isn't enough parking downtown. And what they found is there is plenty of parking downtown. There's lots. But what people are used to is the convenience, being able to park right in front of the store that they want to go to, or find a parking spot within, 30 seconds of looking. And, that is, I guess that's a quality of life issue, if you can easily find parking. But, if you go 1 block away, there's plenty of parking for people, but people like the convenience, and they'll complain if they don't have that convenience, right? And that's true with any city. I think you will hear a lot of people complaining there isn't parking because they want the convenience of being able to just kind of pull
the time, their personal time.
That's true. That's true.
Everybody's very busy.
Yeah, I think it's just important. We really want to point out just the simple idea that folks that don't use parking subsidize those that do use parking. And so we want to address the equity of that as well. And again, people that live in apartments where they're not sort of using a parking space are subsidizing, literally paying the same amount for the most part as the folks that are. So I think, that's just something that, again, factors into quality of life. How much are you spending on parking? How much of your personal budget, your income, are you willing to dedicate towards that? And how much do you want to dedicate towards something else? And how possible is that, given the way that the city is sort of laid out and developed?
So Erik, I know in the last work session, you had kind of gone over sort of the public outreach part of this. Can you just kind of summarize that real quick again?
Yeah, I actually have slides that I'm going to go over, so I'd be happy to sort of get into that section of the presentation whenever
I
we're
had
ready.
a substantive question before we get into the public notice process sort of thing to Evan. First of all, this proposal is a mandate from the state based upon DLCD rules, okay? My first question is, I know that this is challenged by several cities, and it was argued before the Supreme Court, I believe, in the summer. Do you know what the status of that is? And what the scope of that challenge was? Was it to the whole rules or some particular part?
Sure, thank you for the question, Attorney Boone. So there were two legal challenges to the rules. They were combined as one. There are 14 cities in one county involved in that challenge. And then the separate challenge was from the realtors and the home builders and a couple of other folks. And the legal questions were two. One was procedurally, whether we checked all the boxes when we adopted the rules and filed all the right paperwork, the right times to the right people. And the second was just to our general authority, whether we had the authority to do this as a department. So that, as Attorney Boone mentioned, this was argued in the front of the Court of Appeals. Briefs have been filed, amicus briefs have been filed, and it will be decided in the future. That's what our counsel says. It will somewhere between somewhere in the next 2 years, probably. The Court of Appeals has a big docket and no clear timeline on when they would decide this. As a legal matter, there's an interesting thing that's happening because we're adjusting some of the rules based on feedback and some technical corrections that we'll be adopting those again this November. So even if we adopted the first set of rules incorrectly, these new ones, if we adopt them, like, well, those are fine. So, and most of the parking rules are among those. So if our overall authority is found to be exceeded, then that has a broader legal effect than if we procedurally did it right in July 2022. We would just, of course, probably just procedurally redo it and it'd be effective again. So, checking all the boxes that we slightly missed, if we did miss any. So that's my understanding of the legal challenges, where they are, and when we might know.
So to the decision of what to do, you can look at it two ways. One is to comply with the state rules as they exist today. They may go away, depending on the rules, Supreme Court challenge. What is the best for Lake Oswego? Okay, that's the second aspect one could look at it, I think, is to say, regardless of the rules, forget the rules that we're required to look at. What should we do? That's a public policy question, is even if the state didn't make us re-examine it, should we have no parking standards, and let the market drive that? And we could, make that decision. So you could come at it from two different perspectives, I think, as to, well, we're doing this now based upon what the state is doing. We'll do kind of the least onerous to the city. Or we should look at this, forget the rules, and we'll just apply what legislatively what we think we should do. In 1961, they adopted these numerical standards. Should we have those numerical standards still? That's kind of a different way to look at it, I think. The other question I wanted to ask was unbundling before we get into the notice section, is because correct me if I'm wrong, as I see the rules, we would still end up requiring a certain amount. You could still end up requiring a certain amount of parking, but it's required to be unbundled. And so I'm working through my mind and saying, well, how does that work? Like, if you have a property owner who's got a use on it, uses, we would require them to have a certain number of parking for those uses, let's say 25 spaces, something like that. All right, Then, under option 2, we unbundle parking for residential units and you unbundle leased commercial parking. So that means the tenants or the owners, okay, for the residential side, would have the decision whether to purchase those parking spaces or not. But the parking spaces would still be required, they are still there. So you'd have a property owner that has the parking spaces there, but he wasn't able to sell them to anybody, but they're still there. Do we prohibit use of those unbundled parking spaces that are not acquired? I mean, I don't see that in the rule. It just.
Yeah, I'm not, so I'll say a couple of things, and I'm not quite sure I'll answer your question. That one of the reasons for unbundling is it creates an economic incentive for the developer to get parking right. Because if they build too much and they can't lease it out, it's a loss to them. So that is the policy, one of the positive policy outcomes of unbundling is that people are more precise about, oh, I can't just offload this cost on a tenant and they'll have to eat it. It doesn't quite answer your question, but I do think, as I heard you say it, yes, you could require parking outside the transit areas. And if it doesn't get rented, the developer has to have it as a loss.
It sits there unused until, say, the next commercial tenant comes in and wants the right to use it, and then they bundle it. I mean, then they purchase it.
Then they purchase, right. This is very much what happened in Los Angeles, is that some parking was excess in the neighbor, and a redeveloper was like, oh, let me use your parking lot. Great, so.
So it becomes a parking bank that the property owner, commercial in this situation, would have as their tenants come and go, and as they may have a preference, you'd see signs that says, this parking space only for tenant A, this one for tenant B, because tenant A bought it, but then maybe tenant A goes away, the next tenant doesn't buy it, so that sign goes away.
Right, I do see that interesting, yeah.
Okay.
That's my understanding. Because people haven't been chasing down this path, I haven't done a lot of thought experiments.
In some cases, we have uses, outright permitted use is a commercial parking lot, could be. Okay. We don't have any in Lake Oswego, I think, that are, but we could. But in other zones, we don't allow commercial parking lots at this point, as a business. So in that case, the property owner, I mean, I'm just working through the scenarios here. That property owner who may have an excess of spaces because his current tenants haven't purchased those, doesn't have the ability to then operate, those 10 spaces as a commercial parking lot. Okay, so they'd sit there, and I'm presumed used, but just not paid for specifically. But that's where we are on the rules.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough. And I would say of all the cities that have unbundled, only one, I think it's Seattle, unbundles commercial. Almost everyone unbundles the residential side, and that's done it so far in other states. That's an easier challenge than what you're bringing up, maybe for these reasons.
Thank you.
So, but the decision about the use of the parking lots is being made by the city though, right? Just like you have said here?
Well, when you say the use of the parking lot, our zoning code says what outright permitted uses are. Okay. So I think we may end up with a situation if to allow property, it's policy choice. You may end up with a situation in the commercial zones where you're allowing the property owner to have outright permitted use of commercial spaces. So, if they want to sell that parking space or rent that parking space, more likely, okay, rent that parking space to an adjoining property owner rather than one on their own site, okay, turn that into a commercial parking spot for the other one, they could, or they could, open up their own commercial parking lot if that's what was permitted use. We do decide, whether that's a permitted use or not. I think the studies might show, again, I'm one of the lawyers, not the planner, but there may be a higher, I don't know what the turnover rate is, vehicle trips, et cetera. There are some impacts from changing it from a tenant use to a commercial parking space. I mean, where the people, they may stay longer, they may not, I don't know. But that was not considered when we looked at the outright permitted uses, so you'd have to consider that when you expand those uses to include a commercial parking.
So is there, with regard to either of these options, does the city have a preference?
Well, no, that we turn to you, okay? Staff implements, okay? So you and the city council
But your
will,
experience, I mean, in your experience.
I have no
Is there a
everybody
preference?
knows I have no preference on policy, okay? My job is to make sure you're aware of the options. Staff's job is to make sure you're aware of the implications, and I try to make sure the regulations accomplish those. And things change, policies change, sort of thing. So I have no preference. I'll let it to policy directors.
Yeah, I will say we did get direction from city council to primarily explore option 1, the citywide repeal. There was some interest in certain components of some of the other strategies, but I think at least 4 of the councilors expressed support for option 1, at least tentatively. So we do have some direction to really spend a lot of time thinking about option 1. But there was also, some interest in some of the elements of option 2, not really as related to unbundling parking, but really more related to some of the ability for there to be incentives related to parking to provide sustainable infrastructure like solar panels or things of that nature. So, at least when it comes down to, does the city think it's a good idea? City council did seem to favor option 1. That's not a final decision, though. It was just kind of a really initial straw poll. I will say, from a staff implementation point of view and cost for just us to implement this, option 1 is by far the most simple and would be the it would save a lot of staff time. It would save a lot of staff sort of expenditures and how much we have to sort of work to explain what would become a lot more complicated regulations. So, I guess to the extent that that's in line with other city council goals to streamline the development code and make development a little bit more predictable and easier for both staff and developers to understand, that would be in support of that goal as well.
So Erik, just a quick comment on, you mentioned solar panels. Just building codes are trending towards requiring solar panels on new development. I know in California, they require it on all new commercial construction, and we're going to start seeing that begin to happen in Oregon as well. So that may already start to get handled on the building code side of things.
Yeah, it's not
just an FYI.
Yeah, it's not necessarily a silver bullet, and there are a lot of things happening in the development code in addition to what you mentioned, just related to electric vehicle charging capacity and things, in addition to what we'll have in the development code. So it's important to think about, avoiding overlap, making sure that we're not just duplicating what's already in the building code, of course, and thinking about how we can supplement that or reinforce it if that's what we want to do.
Or more importantly, contradicting. That's when it gets
Yeah,
hard.
probably not a good idea to do that. Yeah. Were there any other questions before I get into these slides? This is just kind of handling the additional content that I had for you in the staff report.
I guess what you just said these last 10 minutes has been very informative. Like, I had no idea that there was, court cases going back and forth. So it seems like it's really quite a shifting, could go this way, could go that way. We have to work with what we know today, but tomorrow could change.
As is planning.
Okay.
That is case.
Okay, that
Yes.
was just, for me, that was
Right.
like a big piece.
Yeah,
of
and
the
that's why,
puzzle.
that's why I push back on the issue that's, the characterization that we repealed the parking standards, in certain areas where the mass transit is frequent, okay? Definition, frequent is 1 hour?
Well,
Definition, well,
it's more complicated than
Okay,
that.
a little more complicated than that,
for
okay.
you, it's
But-
that one line.
But
Yes.
the point is that the city council the Planning Commission did not go through a policy discussion about repealing our code, okay? But we don't enforce it because at this point, there's this state rule to do so. But that's being challenged. So you're right, there are some things in motion. And the question is, how far out do we go on this gangplank? You know?
Right.
And maybe from a policy, I'm not a policy person, but
This is
maybe you
like
embrace the whole
three-dimensional
concept.
chess kind of thing, right?
Or maybe you take a little baby step.
I will say, the fact that we're here at all and that this is a project being presented to the Planning Commission means that we have direction to move forward on it.
Well, we have
Yeah, we have to by state law. So there really isn't much use to entertaining that hypothetical in terms of the lawsuit or the suit, filed against the state. But I would mention, though, that last year we didn't necessarily make a decision on this as a city because I think the city council was waiting to see what happened with the election in terms of the governor's race. And I think once they saw that it was a similar sort of type of administration that was coming in, there was a decision to just go ahead and move forward. And I think any hopes that city council had at that point that things could, maybe be overturned by governor's order or something of that nature were extinguished. So we did go through a bit of a discussion with city council about a holding pattern due to some of those concerns, but we're about a year after that at this point, so we definitely have direction to move forward and comply with the rule, with the law.
So do you want to proceed with your
your slides? I can go ahead and get started, and hopefully I'll be able to get these through really quickly here. So I just wanted to cover a few additional topics tonight. And again, thank you, Evan. That was a very informative presentation again, and it was really useful. I really appreciate it. So I just really wanted to remind everybody where we're at in terms of the project schedule, really quickly review what we've done so far to comply with CFEC, really quickly review the Phase B rules, but in really the service of showing you some of the applicability maps that I was able to generate, and a few slides addressing some of the questions that we received from the commissioner at our last work session on CFEC. All right, so just in terms of the project schedule, you can see we're currently at Planning Commission work session number 2. We have about 5 different, or actually 6 now, work sessions studied with the Planning Commission and 6 study sessions with the City Council. We're also planning to go out and do a lot of outreach in March, and we'll be holding a public workshop at that point to try to get a little bit of more of input from the community really as to where this should go. Given the limited options, we're really trying to get a little bit of initial feedback first before we go out and do that public workshop event. That's why we kind of set this up in the schedule so that we have a little more of a set of a menu, I suppose, to discuss with them. So this is kind of what that looks like. We'll move from discussion of the different alternatives at our next work session, again with a heavy focus on that option 1 due to council guidance. Then we'll move into sort of initial recommendations, refinements, then we'll start drafting code. The intent is to get this done by the end of the year next year. That's our deadline, December 31st, 2024. Right now, we're looking at final adoption on November 19th after a city council hearing on November 5th of next year. It is possible that less will be required, so this could be changed depending on I guess the complexity of really what we're looking at. Depending on which option we go down, there could be a lot more content to explain than perhaps some of the other options. So this is subject to change in terms of the scope of the number of work sessions in particular. All right, so just in terms of actions that the city has taken to date to comply, I think we're already familiar with this. I went over this at our last work session, but you can see the general sort of pieces of the climate-friendly and equitable communities rules here. We've already complied with parking phase A, as well as the electric vehicle charging requirements, and are not subject to the housing and climate-friendly areas requirements. So we will be focusing primarily on parking phase B in an update to the transportation systems plan next year, which will be primarily led by engineering, but we'll be hearing about it at the Planning Commission as well. Just kind of a refresh of what Evan already covered. So we've already gone through and implemented state requirements related to CFEC parking Phase A through a direct application of the state statute. So instead of having this within our actual development code, what we've done is reference the state statute and include a map of areas where currently no parking is required. So basically everywhere you see on that map in yellow, there are no parking requirements. So anywhere within a half mile of Highway 43, more or less. Only one parking space per unit is allowed for multifamily development throughout the city, regardless of location. And currently, citywide, we don't have any requirements related to parking for smaller residential units, less than 750 square feet, affordable units, childcare uses, facilities for people with disabilities, or shelters. So these are the things that are already in effect currently. So just a sense of kind of the landscape there. It's actually a significant chunk of the city, as you can see, and actually encompasses entire neighborhoods like Old Town or Foothills, most of the actual First Edition portion of First Edition, Forest Hills, and others as well. So really just gives you a sense of the scope there. We've already also done some work to implement directly the state requirements related to electrical vehicle charging, really just requiring 40% of all spaces have conduit for new multifamily residential buildings and new mixed-use buildings. So that's something we've already implemented in the code. And we're talking now about Phase B, the things that we have not done yet that we would be required to do to comply with CFEC. So these are some baseline provisions that I just wanted to really broadly and quickly explain. We already comply with a number of these, as a matter of fact, but we would have to make sure that I think we comply with about 3 out of these 7. So basically, we'd have to implement all 7 of these. So the preferential placement of carpool van pool parking we already do. We already allow for the redevelopment of a parking lot for bike or transit, or and shared parking as well. But we would need to do a little bit more to allow and encourage the redevelopment of underutilized parking and comply with some of the other requirements. So require for surface parking lots more than a ½ acre in size, that they would have either a certain amount of tree canopy or provide some sustainable infrastructure of some type, green energy technology or solar panels. We'd also have to require street trees along driveways or a minimum of 30% canopy coverage over parking areas, and also require the provision of pedestrian facilities between buildings and pedestrian-oriented rights-of-way. All of that we'd have to do regardless of the option. We'd also have to establish off-street parking maximums, which, as Evan mentioned, we already are mostly in compliance with. I think there might be some small tweaks that we might need to make for uses above 65,000 square feet in size and potentially some commercial uses, but essentially we'd need to establish consistent parking maximum, and it could be the case that we actually have in some cases, and we can talk about this more, we might have a little bit lower parking maximums than we could. So I thought that was interesting. So we might have the ability to still comply and actually increase the maximums in certain cases. So that's just something to keep in mind. In terms of the general options that we have for compliance, this is an old version of what Evan was sharing with you before. Just, I really don't want to talk too much about these 2 or the 3 different options, but just want to kind of continue to go over them so that we kind of get a sense of what all is involved with each of them. So obviously option 1 is the most simple one. We would repeal parking mandates throughout the city. Options 2 and 3 both include a lot of sort of their own baseline provisions, if you will, regardless if you do 2 or 3. You still have to do a number of you still have to comply with a number of provisions related to reducing parking burdens for, based on shared parking, solar panels, et cetera. Parking space accessibility, sort of existence of on-street parking. So I think a lot of this, I don't want to get into the details, but I will just mention option 2 is the fair policies approach. You basically select, it used to be 3 of the 5 policies, now it will be 2. Either it would involve unbundling parking for residential or commercial, flexible commute benefit, parking, sort of commercial parking tax, or no more than a ½ space per unit for multifamily. Again, remember that multifamily citywide is only 1 space per unit currently, so that would be a bit of a reduction in the sort of minimum requirement there. Option 3 would be sort of what they refer to as a parking management approach. A lot of different, so in addition to a reduction of, basically saying no mandates within climate-friendly areas and within a half-mile walking distance of climate-friendly areas, there would be no mandates for a number of different uses. So we're talking about specific uses like bars, taverns, and schools, as well as, it relates to the location of different properties in certain ways. It relates to whether a property is vacant, whether a business is expanding. There are a lot of different sort of elements, not just land use specifically, but sort of about the types of a development where we would have to look at that and say no parking required for this. So yeah, changes in use, expansions of I think less than 30%, redevelopments, et cetera. So essentially, it would be a climate-friendly area-focused approach, but there would be additional provisions that would apply to various different uses throughout the city in a citywide context. So really, I'm just wanting to put this in context with maps. So this is very broad. There are a lot of things that sort of complicate this, and there's a lot of nuance that might not be included here, but just broadly speaking, we're looking at sort of the extent of where commercial parking requirements would apply under the different options. And you can see under option 1, there would be no parking required for commercial use throughout the city. And you can see in that map, we've highlighted basically all the zones where commercial use is allowed. On the map on the right there for options 2 and 3, you can see it would be primarily focused in the areas where there are climate-friendly areas, if you will. So there's no parking required for commercial use. For the most part in those areas, there's some nuance depending on which option you select for 2. But for the most part, this is kind of just a sense of how that would change in terms of the commercial sort of applicability. Again, lots of nuances here, and I'm happy to explain those if you're curious. In terms of residential, you can see option 1. It's a bit confusing the way that it appears on this map, so it's really not the best map. I guess I would primarily direct your attention to the yellow. So option 1, you can see basically all the areas in the city where we allow residential use would have no parking required for residential use. 2A, you can see that's the one that kind of would involve the no parking mandates within a quarter mile of climate-friendly areas. You can see that sort of where that would apply to residential uses under that scenario. Under 2B, you can see what that could look like. So that would not involve the climate-friendly area approach, although I did highlight a bit in the Lake Grove area that depending on the option that you went with option 2, that could still look like some reduced parking mandates in the Lake Grove Village Center area. It doesn't necessarily have to turn out that way, but almost every one of these approaches would have some applicability within those areas. And then option 3 there, you can see really it's similar to 2A, except for it's a half-mile distance from those climate-friendly areas, so it expands the applicability of the reduced mandates a little bit further. And I just wanted to go through and say, on options 2A and 2B, that could involve some combination of either unbundling parking or additional types of regulations based on, the options that we've discussed so far. So it's not just this sort of repeal of parking, there's more involved. Same with option 3, it would also not just involve the reduction of parking mandates, but also the addition of parking management of some variety, and it could look like unbundling as well, depending on the route we go. But those options are significantly more complicated, I suppose, but I'm still trying to show sort of broadly where they would apply within the city. I will now just go through the last few slides here, wanting to address some of the questions that we received from the commission at our last work session. Commissioner Mitchell had asked it at that work session, really what is the purpose of parking requirements? Why are they here? And our research kind of showed that there's no good answer. It was, response to roads and highways being constructed in the first place and a lot of land use ordinances being passed. But essentially, based on some of the research we looked into, and as Evan mentioned, a lot of people either just kind of asked nearby cities what they were doing or looked at, this sort of ITE handbook that gives you lots of precise formulas for how much parking is required for an exterminator or a massage parlor or a pet cemetery. So there's a lot of really specific uses that I just have no idea where they come up with these numbers, but those are included in that handbook. So, again, really could not find an explicit rationale. And even when we look through the city's legislative history, when we adopted this in 1961, originally sort of adopted some of the parking requirements, essentially at one point the city attorney called the attention of the council and the planning commission that the off-street parking requirements were impossible to comply with, and he had no solution to offer. There was no change made to the parking requirements after this comment, so there was a whole sort of work session scheduled to go over and try to find a workable version of the parking requirements. They didn't do that. They didn't change them after this. So I just thought that's kind of interesting to point out based on what we could find. The sort of whatever was passed was deemed to be impossible to comply with by at least one member of staff. So I thought that was interesting. So there's no clear answer. I guess that's the answer to that one. We had another question about whether the city could legally require unbundled parking. I think we talked about this a bit, but essentially, just a reminder of what unbundled parking is that the parking spaces would be rented, sold, or leased separately from the unit itself. We couldn't find any laws that would preclude the city from requiring unbundled parking. We know that other cities have done this. So, I think the answer is yes. The city can legally require unbundled parking to our knowledge. I want to point out that some of the processes related to unbundled parking are a bit unique, and it would require the city to establish a process to determine and publish a minimum rate for parking. So a sort of per space rate, a monthly rate for parking. The city would be expected to do a survey of monthly parking rates and to develop our own sort of price index or monthly sort of parking rate as a city, and we would develop that based on this survey where we're looking at, how far things are from the areas where we surveyed the parking rates to sort of develop what the rate should be citywide. So that's something that we don't currently do, and we would sort of be getting into pretty new territory if we were to take something like this on. There was also sort of some suggestion from DLCD that those rates be reevaluated at regular intervals. So something that staff would likely probably have to revisit on a regular basis to take stock of, is this still the monthly parking rate that makes sense in the city? So yeah, the city would have to establish that sort of parking rate for market rate parking in the city, which is interesting. So I just wanted to point that out. We also had a question, I think, from Chair Stewart regarding whether the city could require fully accessible parking, or I think he might have said, or Chair Stewart might have said, can we bundle accessible parking with units? And I'm just kind of interpreting that as, can we require fully accessible parking? The answer is no more than we do currently, more or less. So currently in the building code, there's parking requirements related to accessible parking. Essentially when parking is provided, there are some ADA spaces that need to be provided as well for most housing types other than single unit housing, duplexes, or townhouses. So CFEC doesn't change the applicability of those laws or allow us to require more, but that doesn't mean that we can't look into potentially incentives that could result in the construction of more accessible parking spaces. And that basically covers everything. I know that there was a lot more of a sort of request for analysis from particularly Commissioner Scanoni on the pros and cons. So we are working on that. There's a lot going on in terms of new information on this project and sort of trying to respond to some of the direction that we're getting from council. But yeah, that is forthcoming. And yeah, I can handle any other questions that you might have at this point based on either what I went over or what Mr. Manvel went over.
I had one sort of, we'll call it a process question. So once we ultimately make a decision, then that gets presented up, and then do they just adopt, or they might say, well, thanks, but we're gonna go in another direction? Does that happen, or? You're saying, yeah, it could be, right?
Yes. It could go, you are an advisory body, so the city council is asking for, recommendation from the planning commission on the climate-friendly and equitable communities rules and our compliance with them. So they could, basically they are, sort of directing you as an advisory body to come up with a recommendation with the guidance that they want to primarily focus on option one. And they, essentially may or may not agree with your final recommendation. And there will be another hearing at city council where they will have an opportunity to consider that.
And who presents that to them?
I do, more or less. Yeah, I mean, it'll be myself and, if there are any consultants working on it at this point, but yeah, the project manager.
Which I think is a good question or a good point. You can make a recommendation, say option one, whatever. You also might couple with that, these are the advantages of this, and this is the disadvantages of this,
You're gonna try and
and
sell
flush
your
it
point
out
of
for
view,
the city
right?
council.
Yeah.
Because you're going to spend the detailed time of why you think this might be more acceptable to the city or less acceptable to city residents type of thing.
Yeah.
And so kind of explore the options and develop a record that they can look at.
Yeah, agree.
And it certainly, does happen that, planning commission and city council aren't always exactly on the same page. So, but that's not to say that most of the time the, recommendations aren't respected and fully considered.
Okay, so then the next step for you is we'll have another work session a couple more months from now, right? Is there any specific feedback that you need from us other than sort of what we've discussed tonight?
I think, I think any feedback, the feedback specifically that would be helpful would be if there are any concepts that you think need to be unpacked a little bit more here that you really aren't comfortable with, or if there's any, not necessarily like what is option, 3, subprovision, 7 or whatever, but concepts that we've discussed that you think need a little bit further explanation that we could help out with or provide you with some materials that would be helpful.
I wouldn't mind learning a little bit, and you can tell me if this is the place to flesh that out or not, but like if we do go down the path of some version of mandating unbundled parking, how do you administrate that? I mean, that's all, because like you're saying, that's something unique for you all, and
Yeah, I think, that could be a large discussion item, so I'm happy to present that, but I did not receive any word of support for unbundling parking from anybody so far, so as staff, when I'm looking for issues to explore further, that wouldn't be the one that sort of rises to the top for me. It is confusing, but, do we want to spend a bunch of time on something if there's limited interest?
It's
Yeah.
the greatest idea either, but I'm just one person, so.
But, what you mentioned earlier about selling the final decision up the chain to have those kind of questions in your presentation.
Right, because it's.
All of a sudden bring more weight to your point of view,
we don't,
right?
maybe necessarily we don't support it, but here's why we don't.
Exactly, yeah, so
Yeah.
you've got the mechanics behind
Right,
supporting it.
no, that makes perfect sense.
If I may, Chair Stewart, we do have a 5-page explanation of how unbundling parking has worked in other cities on our CFEC website. So again, we don't have the Oregon-specific experience, but there is 5 pages of how it's worked there. So if you're wanting to skim something and not give Erik extra work, you could skim that, and if it whets your appetite, ask him. Give him more
There's a
work.
lot of information.
Yeah, I gave you way too
I'm
much
sure
stuff.
Erik
I
doesn't
realized it was like a
mind.
217-page packet or something,
Yes,
so.
and that was very helpful, thank you.
I wanted to answer all the questions, but I would encourage, maybe if there's something in that handout that didn't make sense, or, I guess I'm happy to answer questions on unbundled parking, but when it comes down to like how the city would implement it.
Oh, there-
I think some of those
Yeah,
specific questions might be a
yes,
little.
there is actually, attachment H is a document on guidance on unbundled parking, which is probably what
There
you're
you go.
referring to.
Yep.
I guess I'll say I haven't gotten that far yet.
Right here.
Yep, okay, thank you.
It is a very informative handout, and there are a variety of informative handouts from TLCD that have been very helpful. So I included a lot of them. I did my best to summarize them in the staff report, but there's a lot of detail. So if there's anything that is confusing or requires further explanation, just let me know.
Erik, I have a question. You said that the city council directed you to primarily explore option one, and what does that mean in terms of what you're going to do now and what you will eventually bring back and explore? Like, are you not digging as deep anymore on option 2 and 3?
Yeah, I guess we received direction not to necessarily go through option 2 and 3 line by line. So I think certainly if there is, again, I think it's best to focus on concepts at this point. So if there is an interest in focusing on parking management districts as a concept, or if there is interest in unbundled parking, we can talk a little bit more about that, or flexible commute benefits, commercial parking taxes, whatever those might be. Happy to look into those. I think that's kind of the approach that we're preferring to take, as opposed to just talking about all 16 provisions or whatever every single time. But yeah, there's no decision made by City Council. So I think primarily we did get that direction. Some of that was related to the fact that it is much more easy to implement and explain. So I think a lot of the desire was to, not necessarily get bogged down in a lot of these details if they might not get traction.
I would add to that, I think with options 2 and 3, there are probably some of the least burdensome options that we could kind of explore, but like Erik said, probably not get into the detail on every single one of them, because I think one of the city council's goals is to do a comprehensive review of the development code, as Erik mentioned, in order to look at ways that our development code is, has barriers to housing and also economic development, our businesses. So I don't think that the city council would want us to explore options that are going to be overly complicated. But I think options 2 and 3 probably do have some are better than others that we could explore that are less burdensome.
So what should we expect at the next work meeting, which is on the 27th?
Yeah, so I will, again, come with a little bit more of an analysis of the pros and cons, if you will, of the general options. So I think, again, talking less about line by line, what is option 3, what is option 2, just looking a little bit more broadly at pros and cons. And yeah, just talking through those alternatives and getting some actual kind of guidance from you on where to go from there. I think right now, a lot of these conversations, this one and the last work session, is just me providing you with information, providing you with this perspective, and answering questions that emerged during the first one. So I think we'll definitely be getting into more of the decision-making, setting the stage for what we will go out with at the public workshop and some of the public outreach events to get more feedback from the community. So yeah, it's still not the time to make a final decision, but we just want you to help sort of guide us to get the right input from the public. And it's always good to know kind of which options you're leaning towards as well. So, if there's any information that you need to get you there, we also want to be able to provide that in advance. So yeah, I think, there's a lot of information here, so we're also wanting to be a little bit responsive to you all.
Sounds good. Well, if there isn't any other questions, I think we can continue forward. Thanks again to you both for your presentation this evening and for venturing out here.
Thank you for your patience with my ramblings about parking. I can do it for hours. I love it. Anyway, thank you for having me. It's delight. Yeah. There's nothing better than getting out in the communities that we work with. So I appreciate the chance to come visit and chat with you all.
Thank you, and it's nice to meet all of you.
We appreciate it as well. So do we have anything in other business to discuss?
Yeah, I just wanted to provide you another reminder, I guess, about the planning commissioner training coming up on October 4th at 5 p.m. That's a Wednesday. It is something that will be held in Baker City. It's being sort of led by DLCD in coordination with the Oregon chapter of the American Planning Association. It's going to be held in Baker City, but it'll also be available to be viewed remotely, or you can participate remotely. So just wanted to remind you of that, and to respond to Vice Chair Moreno, your question at the last work session about that particular, or not the last work session, but the last Planning Commission meeting, you had a question as to whether travel would be reimbursed by the city. And unfortunately, we're not able to cover travel for that particular training. So just wanted to get back to you on that.
Thank you.
Eric, can I give you a sneak preview of a closer option?
Oh, yeah, there might be more
for PC
opportunities coming
training.
up that aren't in bigger city.
Sorry to jump in, but since it came up, I'm working with OAPA to plan a planners network meeting for January or February timeframe next year in Milwaukee. And the Planning Commission training is offered as part of every single one of those meetings. So we would plan to do that. It would be like a Thursday night in January or February, and it would be just across the river. So if you miss Baker City, then that could be a backup option.
That is extremely
That is a
relevant
bit
and
closer.
helpful. Yeah. And so, yeah, I guess if you do want to go in person, that would be a much more convenient option. But it wouldn't be until probably January or February, it sounds like. So if you want to go sooner as well, you might want to look at the Baker City one remotely.
So what, just occurred to me, one other thing, so next week, the tour that we're doing in lieu of the meeting, is that confirmed for 4 o'clock?
To the extent that we have planning commissioners that are able to attend, then that is confirmed. I think we just wanted to make sure that that works for you all. So the idea was to try to maximize the amount of daylight there. But that is what we have been planning on, and that is, yeah, we just wanted to make sure that that time worked for all of you.
That is a meeting of the planning commission, is that right?
Yep.
Okay.
It will be a meeting of the Planning Commission, but it'll take the form of a tour at the Merrillhurst campus of the sort of affordable housing development that's underway there. So we'll have instructions for you on where to arrive. Generally speaking, we have some maps and instructions from the development team for you all, and where to sort of convene. And we'll have other kind of instructions about what to keep in mind. You'll have to make sure to wear closed-toed shoes, hard hats, et cetera. Some of that will be provided. But we will get you all the information out about that. But it is set at least for Monday, October 9th.
So they'll probably provide hard hats and vests, right?
Yes, if you don't have them, but not closed-toed shoes. You'll have to bring your own, of course. Yeah.
Or you could wear a bright orange shirt as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we can move on now to schedule review.
All right, and I will keep this one quick as well. So coming up at our next meeting, as we just mentioned, is a tour of the affordable housing development at Merrillhurst, or Merrillhurst Commons as they're referring to it. So we will have Colin Morgan Cross and potentially other staff from Mercy Housing Northwest, who is the developer at that property, do a little bit of a tour. This is something that will give you some background, of course, prior to the meeting and at the meeting, but it's something that went under a zone change and a development review permit here at the city, and the city did support in the form of sort of various different fee waivers and things of that nature. So using it as an opportunity to really talk about some of the housing production strategies that the city currently employs in action at an actual site where they're under construction or have already topped out. So you can kind of see that in action and what that looks like in the field. Coming up at the next work session on October 23rd will be our first work session about the annual code amendments this year, which is going to take the form of annual code amendments in combination with some cleanup items for middle housing. So a lot of the cleanup this year for just our yearly cleanup was really focused on middle housing because that was a new element to our code. So we'll have Ellen Davis here to lead us through some of the proposed amendments for this year at our first work session there. Then on November 13th, we'll have our first work session on the housing production strategies. So that's kind of the next phase of our work on the housing needs analysis, which was adopted at least by you all earlier this month, rather. And we'll be going to City Council for a hearing on the 3rd of October. But essentially, once that's adopted, we'll move into the next housing production strategies phase of work, and we'll have our first work session on that in early November. And then late November, we'll have our next work session on CFEC parking. So back to this conversation and really just wanting to keep you updated with new information and sort of background materials, things of that nature, as soon as I get them and can provide them to you. So apologies that I was providing a lot of attachments and a large packet this last time, but hopefully there's a lot to dig into there. And yeah, that should take us up for the next couple months.
It sounds good. Thanks. Any questions on schedule?
I have a quick question. Erik, on the key at the bottom of the forecast, I noticed this a couple weeks ago, but I never asked. There's a acronym CCPC that says joint meeting with city council. But does that ever happen? Like, does that literally mean we meet in the same room with the city council and debate with them?
It has happened in the past, and that's why it's on there. It has not happened lately, and I don't know that it's happened in this City Hall council chamber, that there are new council chambers since we relocated from next door in the old City Hall. So yeah, that is something that would certainly make sense for, obviously there's a lot of overlap. Evan gave very similar presentations to the two bodies. So, I think we're always looking for opportunities to make that happen. It's just pretty complicated scheduling wise. So, we could certainly make that happen, but it might be a little bit complicated. So that's why we haven't done it lately. But there's always, it's good to have an opportunity to try to figure that out too. So
I wasn't advocating one way or the other. I was just simply asking.
It would certainly save my time if we did that, but.
Sure.
Councilor Afghan, did you have a question?
I had a comment regarding the parking conversation that you were having. I don't remember the city council making a decision or giving a direction that let's go with option one. But the conversation was option one seems to be the easiest to administer. But again, there was no decision and no direction. As one of the commissioners said earlier, is your job is to look at these options and say, what option is best for Lake Oswego? And what are the pros and cons? And the way I would do it is, what are the pros and cons? And this is our recommendation based on pros and cons. This is the best option for Lake Oswego. And I don't think the city councilors can just throw it out the window and say, no, we want to go a different direction. So there is a lot of conversation about option one, but I wanted to clarify that there's no decision and there's no recommendation. Even I said that in the city council meeting that I can be persuaded for option one, but I want to know what happens to these neighborhoods with going that direction. So I wouldn't get very focused on city council wants option one, because that's not true. It's going through the process, what makes sense for Lake Oswego, and then make that recommendation to city council.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, we did here primarily explore option one from Mayor Buck, and 4 of the 7 councilors, not necessarily Councilor Afghan, did lean towards option one, but again, no decision was made. So we got that sort of direction to primarily explore it.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
That's what we'll do. Thank you. And with that, I think we are adjourned.